So there's a bill before the Victorian Parliament, which is the state of Australia where I live, that proposes to make legal sex a matter of self-identification. In particular, it asks for a statement of belief that you are the sex that you nominate, and that you make that statement of belief official through a statutory declaration. So if this bill goes through, it changes the legal definition of sex in Victoria. These kind of bills are on the table in other places too. So on the table in New Zealand, they've recently deferred given problems in the democratic process leading to the bill. And of course, well known in the UK, proposed reforms to their Gender Recognition Act. And these changes have already been introduced in some countries too. So at the moment, someone's legal sex in Australia is determined either by her biology, so as observed at birth and then recorded on her birth certificate, or by her having gone through some sort of sex reassignment surgery procedure. That's true in Victoria, or clinical assessment in some of the other states of Australia, and then on that basis have obtained a change of the birth record. Okay, so that's the reason why there's something to talk about here. Before we had marriage equality in Australia, the question that seemed to really interest judges in talking about cases where legal sex was at issue was what that would mean for same-sex marriage. So a lot of the cases that we know about from the case law involve the question of whether marriages involving transsexual people were valid. And then the question was, at least in some cases, whether this would look to be supporting or upholding same-sex marriage before that had been made legal. Now that we're post-marriage equality in Australia, and then also these other countries where sex self-ID bills are on the table, the question has shifted. What's at issue now seems to be the question of access to single-sex spaces, services, and provisions. And that's what I'm going to be talking about more here. So the research question is, do female people have the right to exclude male people from their single-sex spaces, particularly regardless of their gender identity? So of course it's not that controversial that female people have a right to exclude male people, at least who don't have a feminine or womanly gender identity, because we tend to have a lot of social support for the idea of single-sex spaces. In at least some cases. So really the question is, do women have a right to exclude trans women from women-only spaces? And I should just say, I'm using women as a sex term in this talk, so synonymous with female. That's not supposed to be a way of taking a stand on what conception of gender I think is the right one, or to say who that conception of gender includes or excludes. It's just to say that whatever the right account of gender is, if there in fact is one, it can find another word than women. Why? Because self-referring terms are conceptual spaces, and they're part of the package of women-only spaces that I'm interested to defend in this talk. So regardless of what the right conception of gender is, female people / women have sex-based rights, both morally and legally. And to advance these rights, they need some single-sex spaces, provisions, and services. Okay, so as I talk about women and women-only spaces here, I mean to be kind of stipulating a usage that is synonymous with female. Okay, just so that we're not talking past each other too much, it's worth stressing that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the class of trans women. So this research question about whether women have the right to exclude trans women from their single-sex spaces. We're talking about trans women as though there's a kind of unified or monolithic group, and there isn't. So let me just stress there's differences in type of transition, in length of transition, and in motivation for transition. And these might all be differences that we think make a difference to the question of exclusion or inclusion. So differences in type of transition, so in some cases there is surgical transition, which means sex reassignment surgery to alter some primary sex characteristics. There's hormone therapy, which alters some secondary sex characteristics. So someone might not have a surgical transition, which means they retain male genitalia, but they have hormone therapy, so they might have breasts, for example. Then there are some trans women who only engage in presentational cues, so they don't transition surgically or medically, but they present in a feminine way, or what they take to be a feminine way. And then there are also some trans women who do none of those three things and merely make an assertion that they are women or that they are female. Okay, there are also differences in the length of transition, also the time at which a person did transition. So someone might transition before going through a male puberty. So that will obviously have interesting implications. If they haven't gone through a male puberty, we might want to treat them differently when it comes to thinking about sports, for example. They might transition as an early adult, or they might transition much later in their life, say around or after retirement. And of course, that all makes a difference to the extent of sex-based socialization that they may have experienced. And then one big fault line in this discussion is the difference in motivation. So between trans women who have an experience of gender dysphoria and trans women who are motivated by queer theory. And of course, this doesn't mean they have to have all been reading Judith Butler as their kind of reason. It means that queer theory has trickled down into the culture, and so there are sort of popular ideas about gender and gender identity on the basis of which some of these people might be acting. So I've bundled that together with social influences as well. Okay, so if we can just keep in mind that kind of heterogeneity as we go through the rest of the talk, I think that will be helpful. Okay, so women-only spaces. Here's a list of the kinds of spaces that came up in public discussions over reforms to the legal recognition of sex in the various countries where this has been on the table. So I think where there's been the most heated discussion and I've paid the most attention is the UK context. So almost all of these discussions have happened between women and in the media, and there have been kind of high profile cases of each of these, I think, being contested as well. So you see here, prisons, changing rooms, bathrooms, shelters, refuges, gyms, sports, schools, shortlists, prizes, quotas, political groups, events, festivals, and terms. Where by terms I mean things like woman, lesbian, female, and so on. And just for interest, although of course it will depend what country you're in and which country you're most interested in, I've also included the kinds of spaces or space-like provisions included in both the Australian Sex Discrimination Act and then the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act. So of course these will differ from country to country, but you see there things like sleeping accommodations being mentioned, or contact with people in a state of undress, clubs, and so on. So I've just tried to consolidate these into one list, as you see at the top there. So some of the things were already mentioned. Contact with people in states of undress comes under things like changing rooms or fitting rooms. So I've just basically added accommodations and clubs to the list as well. Okay. It's important to make a point about the methodology here as well. So there are two sorts of approaches one could take to thinking about spaces. I'm taking an approach where I consider this set of spaces as a package, and then I'm going to be interested in arguing that there are many moral rationales for that entire package of spaces. But of course there's another way you could approach this. You could just say, we need to talk about each of these things one at a time. So I'm just going to ask about refuges. And then I'm going to ask, what are the moral rationales for having refuges? Whose interests are bound up in having these? Who should we include? Who should we exclude? And why? So I'm not taking the piecemeal approach here. I'm going to try for this thing that I think is harder, but I think actually we can do, which is to take a sort of holistic, universal approach, treat these together as a set, and see whether we can justify them as a set, which I think we can. So there are two main reasons why I think we can. One is that they clearly have something in common, so it's not an accident. It's not just, yeah, there's clubs and why might that be, and yeah, there's prisons, why might that be? It's that we have single-sex spaces and services in response to female people's situation in the world, which is to say, historical injustice against female people, or the way that female people have been treated or excluded. So for example, as women were entering the workforce and facing harassment from men in men's facilities, they're pushed to have their own bathrooms. And we could tell a similar kind of story about at least some other of these spaces. And a second reason why we should treat them together as a set is that in lots of cases, women themselves have been centrally involved in establishing or creating these kinds of spaces as a way of advancing their political interests. So for example, women in the second wave established, funded, volunteered at women's refuges and women's shelters. So these were spaces set up by women for women. Okay, I'm just going to say something quickly about sex-based rights. Maybe this should be fairly obvious, but just in case it isn't, and then we get into the rationales and how they connect up with the spaces. So I think it should be fairly uncontroversial that women have sex-based rights and that women need to keep sex-based rights for so long as there is sex discrimination, which there is. Women have been historically oppressed to the point of being effectively the property of men, and their oppression hasn't been fully mitigated in any country, although of course some countries are doing a lot better than others. So there's still female genital mutilation, female infanticide, child brides, forced marriage, rape, domestic violence, intimate partner strangulation, accidental killing during sex, prostitution, pornography, and forced surrogacy. There's still a lack of reproductive rights in many countries. There's still serious pregnancy and breastfeeding discrimination. Women still undertake the bulk of domestic labour. So just to give a few examples from the Australian context, sexual harassment was only outlawed in Victoria in 1995. Rape and marriage was only outlawed in South Australia in 1976. And it was 1966 when the marriage bar was lifted for the Commonwealth Public Service, where marriage bar means women upon marrying were expected to give up their jobs. Why? So they can do their proper role of being mothers, housewives, wives, and so on. Women are still massively underrepresented in politics, in certain industries, and at upper levels of all industries. And women's rights are recognised in international law through CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And it's crystal clear that the Convention refers to sex, not gender identity, and its repeated references to female biology. So for example, the social significance of maternity, the role of women in procreation, distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of sex. And it also talks about discrimination against women in employment relating to pregnancy and maternity leave and pregnancy and lactation. So as I've said already, some of the way that we can mitigate women's historical oppression and ongoing underrepresentation is by maintaining single-sex services, provisions, and spaces. So for example, women are underrepresented in politics. We can have women-only political party shortlists, as have been used in the UK, as a way to make up for this. And of course, in the UK case, as many of you will know, those lists now include trans women, most notably Lily Madigan being the UK Labour Women's Officer. And I think in talking about heterogeneity, this is a person who has neither surgically nor medically transitioned. So whole separate discussion to be had about that and about whether we should want any male person to be a political representative for women. Okay, for another example, women have been excluded from sport, so we can have women's sports and we can push for them to be equally funded and publicised. Okay, and so on. So what I want to do from this point on is focus on rationales for women's spaces, which is the top line there. So I'm going to say that there are 8. And then focus on the way that they connect up with women-only spaces, this list that we've built earlier. And the argument is that between all these rationales, they together over-determine women's right to exclude all male people, regardless of gender identity, from single-sex spaces. So I'm going to try to end up with a lot of cross-cutting lines from all the rationales going to multiple of the different spaces and ending up thinking we have many different reasons to maintain this package of spaces. Okay, so let's start with safety. Women have an interest in safety from physical assault, from sexual violence. Now, it's true that the risk is fairly low, given that women are most at risk in their own homes. And of course, none of the spaces that we're talking about here are their own homes. So there's a kind of question that we all need to talk about, which is whether what we think the risk level needs to be before it matters. I think it probably always matters. That risk is not zero. And I think that risk, of course, goes up as the egregiousness of the offence goes down. So yes, it's true that sexual assault by a stranger is quite unlikely, quite low risk, but something like voyeurism is higher risk. And this counts as a matter of safety as well. So it looks like the safety rationale will at least justify prisons. There have already been problems with housing trans women in the female estate. So a high-profile case in the UK was Karen White. And of course, just looking forward, the incentives to transition would be huge in order to get out of the male estate and have access to women, at least for gynophilic males. I think the safety rationale might also justify changing rooms, given what we know about the risks to women going up in unisex spaces. Although this depends on whether what we know about unisex spaces crosses over to trans inclusion only, rather than full unisex. So of course this is a matter of spaces being fully mixed sex or only partially mixed sex. The next rationale is privacy, dignity, comfort, which I've sort of treated together as one general rationale. So women don't want to be leered at or sexually objectified or filmed or photographed when they're naked or partly naked. They want to be served by people of the same sex in intimate situations, so like for some medical examinations or in airport body searches. So the medical examinations question has actually become controversial. This has come up in the UK over the question of the NHS obligations when a patient requests a female doctor or nurse, and some of the nurses or doctors on staff are trans women. Does the patient have the right to request someone that is born female? And note also under this justification, women's privacy, dignity, or comfort, that some trauma survivors feel themselves to be in danger around men, particularly in intimate situations, and more relaxed and comfortable around women only. And I think this fear for safety, the inability to relax around men, the having to manage the constant threat of male violence, even if it doesn't eventuate, all of these can be coded as a comfort reason to justify having some female-only spaces. And I think this is particularly important when it comes to shelters and refuges. And again, as some of you probably know, this has become a big issue lately over the last female-only rape shelter in Vancouver, having trans activists work to get its funding its funding removed or cut to have it defunded on the basis of it not being inclusive of trans women. Okay, third rationale, justice and fairness. So some spaces, services, or provisions, as I've mentioned already, are rationalized as in terms of mitigation of the historical injustice of women, or historical injustice against women, so women's exclusion and women's historical treatment. So for example, women's writing prizes are designed to showcase overlooked female talent. And some spaces like sports, for example, are rationalized as necessary for fairness, given male advantage or dominance. So for example, in women's sports, we know there's a roughly 10% performance gap. And obviously this is going to remain between people who are merely statutorily declared women and women, because that just means unaltered male bodies and female bodies. So it seems like the justice, fairness rationale will get us sports, shortlists, prizes, quotas, and perhaps also schools, if these result in better educational outcomes for girls, and if we think this is justified in light of historical exclusions. And I think this rationale is also going to justify terms. So this is the long line on this side. because these are necessary, at least some terms are necessary for women to self-refer and to act politically in order to advance their own interests, which is exactly why the terms woman, female, lesbian, and so on have been so fiercely contested by gender-critical feminists. Fourth rationale, respite. This is really just about having a break from male socialized attitudes, expectations, and behavior, including sexual objectification and attitudes of entitlement to women's bodies. But it's also about more ordinary stuff like mansplaining and interrupting, all of which can be exhausting and demanding to deal with. So I think respite as a justification is going to get us shelters and refuges at the extremes, because these are respites from male violence. But it's also going to get us more ordinary things like campus women's rooms, for example, or women's political groups, events for women during like university orientation weeks or as part of corporate events. It's going to get us things like festivals and dance parties and so on as well.